With the release of Scream 6, today I'm going to be bringing you my ranking of all 6 Scream films from the worst to the best. So I did one of these rankings after Scream 5 last year, and I gotta say, my list has changed a lot. Like, it's not just like we're adding Scream 6 in a specific place. There's a couple other things that I actually switched around as well. Just by rewatching them and thinking about them more, opinions tend to change over time, which is what makes doing lists again very, very fun thing to do. I would like to say before we get into this as well, none of these films are bad. Not a single one of these is a bad film. They basically just go from good to great. Like, that's basically how the Scream franchise is. So just because I put a film you really love in either the bottom spot or the 5th spot, it does not mean I hate it. It does not whatsoever. Like I said, I like all of these. They are all very watchable and enjoyable. It's just a matter of which one do I like more. And for some of them, it's a razor thin difference. So keep that in mind. There will be spoilers for all the films in this ranking. So make sure if you haven't seen the specific film I'm talking about, probably don't watch the video. So let's start off with the number 6 spot, my least favorite Scream film. This one is probably most people's least favorite, and that is, of course, Scream 3. So, like I said, I don't think this is a bad film. I think it's still enjoyable. It's the weakest out of all of them. It's gotta be. So there's a couple of good things I do actually like about it. First of all, the new location in Hollywood was different. It definitely felt a bit different than the other suburban areas in the first 2 films. It still was somewhat suburban for most of it, but I at least liked the change of scenery. They had a pretty good use of the characters of Sidney, Gale, and Dewey, and there was a really cool like callback to Randy they did in the film, which I really liked, because Randy was one of the best characters from the first 2 films, so I liked all that. But this film also probably had the weakest side characters in the franchise. You had Jennifer, Angelina, Mark, Roman. I couldn't even remember the names. I had to write them down on my phone to make sure I can remember them, because they're not memorable characters. They're not that great. Some of them, maybe Jennifer had her moments, but at the end of the day, they're definitely the weakest in the franchise, unfortunately. But that is not the worst thing about this movie whatsoever. The worst thing about this film has got to be the voice changer. I despise that thing because it is so far removed from reality. It just takes me out of the film completely. Like, if that was in today's Scream films, maybe I could see it working with the whole AI stuff going on today. It actually seems a little bit more believable, but in the year 2000, no, they didn't have this type of stuff, especially with it being perfect and they could just recreate someone's voice perfectly. It was just such a lazy plot device just to try to make some of the sequences more interesting. I didn't like it at all. And the killer reveal with, of course, Roman, I didn't think it was terrible, but it's definitely the weakest in the franchise because the reasonings behind what he was doing, they had to do a lot of retconning for prior Scream films to make it work, and it was kind of just like out of nowhere. It was kind of like a big out of left field reach that didn't really do much for me. Now for the next 3 films on this ranking, I could change them literally any day of the week. Like, I'm sure within a week I'll change my mind about this, so don't think it's that big of a deal which one I put above the other, because it's a razor thin difference between each of them. In number 5 spot though, I'm gonna have to go with Scream 6, the newest Scream. It really hurts me to put it here because like I said, it's a good film. I enjoyed it. I gave it an 8 out of 10. But I just can't put it above some of the others. Some of the stuff I liked about it, obviously the New York setting was amazing. It was very different than what we're used to seeing, the city landscape, and they utilized it to a decent degree. You had a couple interesting sequences, like when they're crossing from one building to the other with the ladder. I really liked that scene. Some of the kills were some of the best in the franchise. They actually made them look somewhat gory. They had a lot of interesting connections to the overall franchise, whether it was just a reference or if it was actual story plot lines that connected to prior films. And I think it did it the best out of any film possible. Like, it actually calls back every other film, and it just made it feel like a franchise, which was a lot of the commentary in this movie was about franchises. And so the fact that they reference all the other films, I think was perfect. It had some really good chase scenes, a couple, maybe not all of them were great, but especially the ones in the beginning of the film, the first 2 acts were really, really great. But the 3rd act is where things kind of fall flat for me. The killer reveal was meh. I didn't really see it as a positive or negative. It was just kind of there. And the believability is just so off for this film when it comes to characters surviving the most god-awful wounds you will ever see. So many characters survive, and I'm just like, what? All the time. It just doesn't make any sense. Characters are still fighting, crawling, running after being stabbed all over the place. It's just too much. They don't really kill off any major characters either. The amount of actual characters that die in this film is quite tiny. There's a lot of deaths in general, but a lot of it is background characters and characters we don't really know much about. But in terms of main characters, they don't actually kill off that many, and to me, that was just not a very good idea. The tone was sometimes kind of off, where there was sometimes moments where some pretty major things were happening and characters were being all giggly and fun with each other somewhere else, and it was just it just fell off. It didn't feel like these characters should be reacting in that moment in that way. Even if they're desensitized to what's going on, I still feel like the situation should be a little more severe to them. And it does affect them quite a bit in other scenes, but then every now and then they'll just be like pretending like it's not even going on and they're just having a cute little fun scene. It doesn't really work. And this is a minor nitpick, but there's a couple moments of fan service that I just did not like. It felt forced, like some pieces of dialogue that felt like they were put in there just to kind of make people go, hey, that's kind of a reference. I said I like the references to the other films, I do, but not when it comes across as inorganic. In number 4 spots, I'm gonna go with Scream 5, which was called, of course, just Scream, which I still hate that title. I get what they're trying to do with it. It's supposed to be like a requel, and it's supposed to be making fun of requels, which is why they called it that, but just because you're making fun of it, you're still doing it yourself, you know what I mean? So it still bothers me because now I gotta call it Scream 2022. Let's just call it Scream 5. I think it's a lot easier just to call it Scream 5. This one I liked a lot more when it first came out. If you watch my reviews back when it first came out and you watch my ranking, I actually had it a bit higher on the list and I gave it a really high score. And I still would say it deserves a decently high score because there's a lot about this movie I really like. But the more I've thought about it, the other film that's higher than this one, I just think I like that one a little bit more. But Scream 5, first of all, I really thought the meta commentary on horror requels were actually really interesting. Like I said, I don't like the change of the title being Scream instead of Scream 5, but the commentary on it was perfect for its time because there's so many requels that have been coming out over the past decade. It makes perfect sense to talk about it now, especially even last year in 2022. There was at least like 5 horror requels that came out, so it's just insane how many of them are coming out, so it was the perfect time to talk about that. And the returning characters, although they played a decent role in the story, I do think they were underutilized, and I didn't like how they didn't have much interactions with each other, because obviously you brought back Dewey, Gale, and Sidney, as well as, what was her name, Hicks or something? I forget what the girl's name was. I liked especially Dewey in this movie. He was definitely the MVP here, but the fact that he really doesn't get to do really anything with Sidney or Gale, as many scenes with each other, just to me felt weird. It was almost like The Force Awakens with Han Solo, like you're gonna bring him back and you're not gonna have him interact with the other returning characters. It just felt off to me. And I do think they missed a lot of opportunities to actually have them have scenes together. But I did still like Dewey in this film quite a bit. Gale and Sidney were a bit underwhelming. They didn't do too much. Thankfully, Gale got more to do in Scream 6, but even then it wasn't that much more. At the end of the day, it is not about these characters though. Of course, there's a whole new cast there. And I liked the new cast. I think they're a lot better in Scream 6 though. This one, they were just kind of first being introduced. And my favorite characters of them were probably Tara, Chad, and Mindy, and thankfully they were the ones who were able to survive and go on to the next one. Samantha, I think a lot of people are a bit harder on than I personally would be. I don't think she's a great character by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think she's bad either. Just like Scream 6, there's a lot of situations of characters making really dumb decisions in this movie that just kind of take you out of the moment a bit. I know that's very common in slashers, but it just gets kind of tedious when it happens again and again and again. I'd rather the killer outsmart the main characters rather than the main characters just doing dumb things that put them in situations that they shouldn't be in. In number 3 spot, I'm gonna go with Scream 2. So this one went up a spot compared to my previous list before I actually had Scream 5 above Scream 2. But the more I've thought about it, Scream 2 is actually really solid. The only thing I don't like about it, there was one scene that bothered the hell out of me when it comes to character decisions. Like, it was just really, the characters are just being the dumbest they've ever been in the entire franchise. But everything else, I would have a positive thing to say about it. So first of all, the opening sequence is probably one of the best in the franchise. I don't think it's the best. It's definitely not second best either. Probably third best. It's up there though. It's definitely one of the best with the whole movie theater sequence. It's really just frightening, and you have no idea where the ghost face is going to come from because it's a theater full of ghost faces. So I really like that. The college setting was great as well, kind of changing from the high school atmosphere of the first one. It made perfect sense for them to now be in college. You also had Sarah Michelle Gellar. She wasn't in much of it, but who's not gonna like to see some Sarah Michelle Gellar? Let's be real here. The new characters, Derek, Maureen, and Cotton Weary, they were all fantastic. I enjoyed each and every one of them. I don't think there's a single bad side character of the new people. There's also Mickey as well, and Debbie Salt, which she was actually just, Mrs. Loomis. I actually really like that killer reveal at the end. I think it's one of the best in the franchise because it came out of nowhere. I predicted it, I did, but I don't think most people did. I think most people did not see it coming. The only reason I predicted it is because they kept showing Debbie Salt, and I kept thinking to myself, what's the point of this character? There's no point of this character. Why do we keep showing her? And it turns out to be her. So it was somewhat predictable for me personally, but that doesn't change the fact that I really like the reveal, and I think it being a revenge story makes perfect sense, and it actually works very well for the sequel to the first one. And Mickey just being there, just some crazy dude who just wants to kill people and he wants to blame the movies. Like, it's a very random, motive, but I actually think it works in a combination with Mrs. Loomis. So really love this movie. I think it has a lot of solid stuff to it. It's certainly not the best in the franchise, but I think it's better than I previously had it in my prior ranking. And now we got the top two. In the number 2 spot, Scream 4. Scream 4 is phenomenal, and I will not take any of the slander for this film. I see so much hate for it all the time, probably because there's also a lot of love for it as well, but it's probably one of the most divisive in the Scream franchise, at least in my opinion. I think it's one of the best killer reveals in the franchise because I did not see it coming. Because to me, Scream 4 kind of felt like what Scream 5 was, where it was like almost like a reboot, but still bringing back the legacy characters. Jill felt like she was the new Sidney. I really did think Jill was the new Sidney, and I was completely on board with that. And so the whole time I'm thinking to myself, there's no way they're gonna make the new Sidney the killer. It didn't even cross my mind. That's how surprising it was. I was thinking it could be Kirby or someone else. I had no idea it was gonna be one of the main character, actually the main character, at least I felt like she was in the film. And that killer reveal was amazing. The performance and everything there at the end was just awesome. How Jill was just like running into the wall, just like knocking her face into it so she can play the victim. I thought that was really awesome. I still wish they went a little bit further with it, and if they did, I probably would have had this in my number 1 spot. If it ended with, not about Sidney dying, but maybe Sidney being the one who's blamed for it and actually going to prison, and Jill surviving and moving on. I think that would have been just insane for, the continuation of the Scream franchise after that and what would come after that. And they could have done more with Jill's character. But even then, I still was okay with how they finished it off in the hospital sequence in the end. I think this is for sure one of the best in the franchise. There's a lot of great comedy in this one. The comedy works in this one very well, at least in my opinion. The cast is solid. Of course, you have the legacy characters returning, as well as Kirby, Judy Hicks, and Robbie, as well as Charlie. These are really good characters, and I think it's the best sequel to the first one. But of course, in the number 1 spot is going to be the original Scream from 1996. Now, I am not usually one to say the original is the best in the franchise. I think a lot of people are usually like that. We're like, oh, it's always the original that's the best. I'm usually not like that. There's a lot of horror franchises where I would definitely not put the original in the first place. But when it comes to Scream, yeah, it's gonna be in the first place. So I don't know, it just does everything the best in my opinion. It just has the best killer reveal, especially because if this is the first Scream film you're watching, you're not gonna assume that the character that they make you think is the killer is actually gonna be the killer. The whole time you're thinking, oh no, they're really making it seem like it's gonna be Billy. So of course it's not gonna be Billy. And when that's the case, it actually ends up surprising you when it actually ends up being Billy. So I think the reveal is brilliant. I like the motive behind it. I like what they did with having, Stu be his partner, and they're very different in how they interact with each other. The chase sequences are all really good. There's a lot of decent kills. I wouldn't say they're the best in the franchise. I think Scream 5 and 6 actually have the best kills, but this one still has a couple of iconic kills, like the one with the garage door. It's just iconic. It's not like gory or anything, but it's iconic, and you gotta love it for that. Of course, the characters were amazing. Probably the best characters we've had in the entire franchise. You had Sidney, Gale, Dewey, Billy, Stu, Randy, Tatum. Solid list of characters for sure. And I really did like the meta commentary in this one, probably the most out of any of them, because it was covering horror cliches. That was kind of the meta commentary in that one. And obviously horror at that point in time in the 90s, tons of cliche stuff going on in slashers especially. So the fact that this came out and was able to just make fun of all those films, it was perfect. and you gotta love it for that alone. So that is my ranking. Let me know your guys' lists in the comment section below. I'm expecting to see very different lists. The most common thing I'm expecting to see is probably Scream 3 at the bottom and the original at the top. But what I'm most interested to see is the middle, because there's a big amount of films there that are just really good, but like it's not really clear cut which one's better than the other, at least in my opinion. But I was able to make a list, and I want to see your guys as well. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I will see you all in my next one. Peace out.